I'm confused and perplexed. The McCain-Kennedy bill, the Cornyn-Kyle bill, the Frist bill, the House bill, employment eligibility verification, guest workers, amnesty, visa portability. Oi! The source of my confusion? The current immigration debate with its large questions of political theory and practice and the detailed and nuanced sections of law. To help dispel at least some of my ignorance and confusion is Allan Wernick, law professor at Baruch College, CUNY, chair of the CUNY Citizenship and Immigration Project, and the immigration law columnist for the Daily News. Allan, welcome back. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you for having me back.
Let's talk about the marches. Tens of thousands of immigrants, legal and illegal, and their supporters marched in New York. Hundreds of thousands throughout the United States, 500,000 in Dallas. We had 750,000 in Los Angeles a couple of weeks ago. What's going on? We've got headlines. New York Times, immigrants rally in scores of cities for legal status. Daily News, give us peace of dream. The Post, alien invasion. This has dominated the agenda. It's among the top polling issues facing the country. Talk about the march. You were there. Give me your personal sense and then your larger sense of what's going on.
Well, it was really quite amazing. I mean, people seemed to be coming and coming. There were marches from Chinatown. There were groupings of people that came from Brooklyn. And the way the police set it up was interesting. They gathered people close to City Hall, and as more people came, they just created more and more space up and up Broadway. And what I did is I kept walking up Broadway just to see how far it would go, and it ended up way past Canal Street. So it's really one of the most amazing, impressive things I've seen in New York City. Of course, there have been other marches even larger in some of the other cities in the United States. And I think what's going on is that I think the immigrant community senses that they have some possibilities here. They have a chance of getting out from the difficult situations that they're in, and they're willing to take risks. They're willing to come out and march and protest, even though many people for many years would just sort of hide out. They just didn't feel like it was safe for them to come out. But I think they feel something. There is something in the air. There's something changing. And I think what it is I think that this country is going to have to, this country is recognizing that it will have to come to grips with this issue of undocumented immigration and migration to the United States.
Do we have, and I don't want to get into the politics so much now, we'll talk about it later, does this in your mind signal a sea change in American politics? I mean, you talked about, and others have talked about this as a new civil rights movement with the profound political implications of what the civil rights movement for blacks in the 60s, 70s, and earlier meant. Your sense of this?
It is, and I think what's going on here is that people are recognizing that America is a different place now than it was 20 years ago, and that we've always said we're a land of immigrants. We've always talked about migration to the United States, welcoming immigrants, having the Statue of Liberty, but there's something different going on here, and I think what's different is that the world is getting much smaller, and immigration in Europe, in the United States, and around the world is just becoming part and parcel of the modern lifestyle and the modern era. And I think we're starting to recognize that, and we're seeing that these people are us. It's not that, you know, there's us and the immigrants. These people are us. They're part and parcel of every aspect of our lives. They're in our schools. They're in our colleges and universities. They're in our laboratories. They're inventing things. They're doing everything from, you know, cleaning our hotel rooms to managing multi-million-dollar companies. So they're part of our society, and these demonstrations, I think, and this outpouring of support is something that's being recognized by the body politic, is that that's in fact the case.
So you may have the emergence of a new political activism, particularly among Hispanics, because the illegal immigration issue has been essentially, but certainly not exclusively, a Mexican issue, and particularly in Los Angeles. But in New York, we've got, as the Times pointed out in its Tuesday, this is a very that was a very diverse and eclectic group of marchers. You had Asians, you had people from the Caribbean. What was the composition of the crowd there?
Well, the crowd was still predominantly Latino, not Mexican as much as Latino in general. Of course, a large number of Mexicans, but Colombians, Salvadorans, Ecuadorians, people from all over Latin America. But you also had very large numbers of Asians. You had a group of people from Chinatown. You had a number of Korean organizations that organized large groups. You had English-speaking Caribbeans, Haitians, large numbers of Africans. So you have a much more diverse group of immigrants here in New York City than you do in some other parts of the country. And
these immigrant groups, I imagine, work together in order to accomplish their goals in a way that provides them a political and social infrastructure for future action.
That's right. There is a coalition that was formed to organize these demonstrations, and there are ongoing coalitions like the New York City Immigration Coalition that provide leadership in these situations. I think another point that's worth noting is that I think these demonstrations also reflect a certain maturity, political maturity in the immigrant communities in New York City. In a city like Los Angeles, you know, it used to be part of Mexico, so you have long-standing history of political leadership, middle-class and upper-class political leadership in those communities, but you didn't really have that in New York in many of the communities. And even the communities where you did, they tended to be quite insular. For instance, you note that in the last few years we've had our first Chinese national become a member of the city council. We have 2 Dominicans on the city council. These are relatively new developments. And that kind of political maturity, I think, is happening throughout the immigrant community. So in the Indian, the Pakistani, the Bangladeshi, the Colombian, the Mexican, all of these communities are starting to build organizations, starting to train leadership or have leadership gain that training through experience. And I think that's also reflected in this kind of political activism.
Conflict among and between these groups for, you know, steps on the ladder or slices of the pie, whatever metaphor you want to use. And in New York, you've got to build coalitions, though, or you can't win.
Well, tremendous conflicts. You know, in terms of like who gets the portion of the pie that's available for poor and working people. There have been conflicts, and there continue to will be. There were conflicts between the Puerto Rican and Dominican community, cooperation, but also conflicts. And now you have a growing Colombian political apparatus. The Mexican community is the fastest growing immigrant community in the United States, and of course they have a sort of people watching their back in California and Washington, so they have an extraordinary amount of political power. So you do have these conflicts, but the one thing that people really understand is that for any of these groups to move forward, there has to be attention to the most recent arrivals from those countries. There has to be attention to immigrants and the immigration issue. So I think because of that, people are able to work together, come together around this particular issue. Of course, then they're still going to go back to fighting over who's going to be on the school board or who's going to run for city council. But on the immigration issue, I think we're finally seeing a real coming together of all these particular political groups. And even in Los Angeles, in the Mexican community, I think the leadership there did an extraordinary job of reaching out to other organizations and other nationalities to bring them in to get that 500,000 number.
One thing that I noticed about the 2 marches, and then I want to move off the politics in a sense back to the specific issues in and around this legal debate, is that in the Mexican marches in Los Angeles, for example, there were lots of Mexican flags. In the subsequent demonstrations, they seem to have learned, the leaders and also the participants, that the best flag is the American flag. How do you see this identification with home country in the United States, and what impact does it have on the politics? How does it play in terms of backlash, for example? I mean, if you look at this House bill, which we'll talk about, this is a really restrictive piece of legislation. Does that not backfire the national identification of the immigrants?
Well, I think as a practical matter, it has backfired, and I think as a tactical matter, the leadership has now made it clear to the community. I think the community understands very, very well that it's very important to wave the American flag. Personally, I think it's a little bit, that it's a little bit something that the fans have been flamed by restrictionists. I mean, I don't think it's so terrible that people wave the flags of their countries. I think it's not outside the American tradition for people to maintain times. People mention the Irish
St. Patty's Day
parade,
Columbus Day,
the Israeli Day parade,
right?
Right. So I don't think it's outside the American tradition, but I think that because certain restrictions forces have made such a big deal about it, that the leadership of these marches have been made a tactical decision. They're not going to do it, and I think you're seeing that change. In fact, going back to the marches in Los Angeles against Proposition 187, the restrictionist California law, that was a big issue there, and I think people are finally learning the lesson. I mean, what's the big deal? If this means we're going to get legalization for 11 million people, we'll take home our flags.
Okay. John McCain has called the immigration issue and the legislation surrounding it, quote, a defining moment in American history. But we're sort of talking about this definition, but how did we get here? Let's talk about a little history. Without going back to Adam and Eve and their emigration from the garden, begin with some recent history that led us to the point that we're in now. What's a convenient starting point?
I think a good starting point is the 1986 IRCA. It was called the Immigration Reform and Control Act. And
this is the Simpson-Rodino Act.
Yes, it was.
Okay.
It was ended up calling the Simpson-Rodino Act. Before that, it was called Simpson-Mazzoli. Rodino came in to save it at the last minute. Maybe someone will.
Peter Rodino, former, the late congressman from New Jersey.
That's right, and maybe some superstar will come in and save this new immigration legislation that's being proposed. But that law was supposed to end the problem of undocumented immigration once and for all. It was going to legalize everyone that was here, so that the people here would all be legal.
And we're talking about how many people then? 3 million, 3.5 million?
Well, it ended up being about 3.5 million people at the end of the program. And at the same time, by penalizing employers for hiring workers without lawful immigration status, that all the immigrant workers were going to go home. Those who didn't have lawful papers and who didn't fall under the legalization program.
This didn't happen.
This didn't happen.
I mean, why the false expectations and why the failure?
Well, there were a lot of aspects of the bill that made it doomed to failure from the very beginning. First of all, the bill required that a person be here before January 1st, 1982, but the first applications weren't accepted until May 1987. So right away you have 5 years, and you had to, so you have 5 years of undocumented immigrants who don't qualify at all under this legislation.
And they didn't realize this when they did it?
Well, of course they realized it, but they just felt that if they made it the day of enactment, it would be too generous, or it would encourage people to come here illegally.
So
we
have this huge hole already.
That's right, and a similar hole in current legislation. Then there was a lot of silliness in the bill. Like, for instance, you had to be here illegal in order to qualify. If you were here legally, you didn't qualify. So if you were here as an international student, for instance, before 1982, and you hadn't become illegal before 1982, but let's say you became illegal in 1983, you didn't qualify for under the legislation. Then when the Immigration Service implemented the legislation, they were very restrictive in how they interpreted congressional mandate, so restrictive that it was only up until the last couple of years that Congress, as a result of litigation, and we're talking almost 20 years, has finally resolved the final cases of people claiming eligibility.
From the last reform.
From the last reform. It's just been resolved now. And for years I used to go, after the program was supposedly closed, I used to stop by the legalization office in New York City just to see how things were going. And for years and years they had to maintain an office. So the implementation of legalization was pretty much a failure in the sense that it did not include all or even a majority of the undocumented immigrants here.
And also, what about this employer sanctions that was supposed to be part of this bill? It never happened.
Well, it never happened because employers just weren't going to stand for that kind of government interference. There's never been the penalties were relatively mild, and they've become milder. The standards for determining violation were mild, and they've become milder through subsequent legislation. And the resources put into enforcement were little, and they've become less. So it was basically, I don't think there was any serious intention by Congress of thinking, I mean, no realistic expert would ever think that that kind of program would be
So
successful.
it was almost doomed from the start.
It was doomed from the start.
Its failure was predictable, and on top of it, the law of unanticipated consequences seems to have been operating here as well.
I mean, the good thing about the program is 3.5 million people got permanent residence,
Right.
and I think part of what we're seeing now is the result of that. I mean, these people many of them are U.S. citizens now. They file for their relatives, so it did expand the undocumented, the immigrant population in the United States, and their political power.
Okay, so let's fast forward. Now, do we fast forward 10 years, 20 years? What's the next step in the history before we get to the current day?
Well, I think the next step that we would want to look at is 1996, and that was the year of the passage of the Illegal Immigration Reform Act.
So that reformed the reform of '86. And not very successfully.
Not very
you're laughing.
Well, it was a very punitive and restrictive bill, which is, you'd expect, which I think there's one lesson there is that it's not about Democrats or Republicans, this issue, because that was under President Clinton. But it was a very, very restrictive, probably many historians consider it the most restrictive legislation since the 1952 Immigration Nationality Act under President Truman, which, by the way, he vetoed and was passed over his veto because it was so restrictionist. So one of the things that this law did, I think that has the most impact on what we're doing today, besides creating new grounds of deportation and other kinds of penalties, it made it very difficult, in fact, almost impossible for many people who are in the United States to get permanent residence. So you have a group of people here now who, before 1996, because they're married to a U.S. citizen, because they have an employer who needs them, they're working as a nanny, would qualify for permanent residence, and now they're not going to be able to get it. And they know that, and everyone knows that, because people come into our centers in CUNY, and we talk to them about it. We say, well, I'm married to a U.S. citizen, can't I get my green card? And we say, no, you cannot, and these are the reasons why. So these people are desperate. They know these people marching, so getting us up to the present. Many of them know there's no vehicle for them. Before 1996, there may have been a vehicle, and now there is not.
So they made the reform made matters worse.
And the reform made matters worse.
Either unintended consequences or perverse consequences. This is not
either way.
This is not going very well in terms of social policy. Okay, so we're in 2005, 2006. The House passes at the latter part of 2005 a very restrictive piece of immigration legislation. What led the House to pass the legislation? What was the legislation? Let's talk about the current situation. What exactly is? I mean, there are all these bills. There, as I mentioned at the top, there's the McCain-Kennedy bill, the Corn and Kyle bill, the Frist bill, the Specter bill. Now there's none of those bills, and then you've got the House bill. Just talk about the preconditions that led to the House bill and then the reactions. We'll try to keep this as simple as possible, given its tremendous complexity.
Well, I think that there's a sense in the United States we need to do something about undocumented immigration, and both sides of the debate agree with that.
Okay, what are the both sides? Just briefly characterize the both sides.
Okay, well, one side would say really what we need to do is basically stop people from coming in and try and deport and get rid of the people who are here illegally. The other side would say, well, yes, we need to control the borders. We don't want terrorists, criminals, smugglers coming in. But on the other hand, we need foreign labor, because it's going to be part and parcel of the future growth of the country. We have a large undocumented population here, and it's unrealistic to remove them from the United States. And it doesn't make sense to have them remain here if we can't deport them in this undocumented status where we can't keep track of them and where they can't make their full contribution to American society. So that side would like to see some form of legalization as well as border control, and one side sees border control as sort of the end all and be all.
Well, that's the House bill. The House bill is restrictive. They want to close the borders, in fact, build a fence, and deport people back. I guess it's Tom Tancredo of Colorado sort of is the archetype of this. So they passed the bill in the latter part of December of last year. Then what happens? Then the Senate has all these different bills. Why?
Well, because the Senate has, for a long time, had a broader view. I think it's partly because they represent broader constituency. You know, in the House of Representatives, you have people who are representing a district which may have a very high proportion of people who are very restrictionist. But in the Senate, people have to take this. The senators have to take a broader view. So they've been more anxious to pass legislation that has these two components: the you know, the restriction and the some kind of legalization program. So the House, in response to the most vocal members of that body, which are the people the most restrictionist in their outlook, passed a bill which, as you mentioned, would create a fence, and also would create would make it a felony for someone to be in the United States illegally.
And also, does it also make felons those people who help them, like
yes,
clergy
that's right.
and doctors and
That's
lawyers?
right. So under certain circumstances, it would make individuals who provided care and assistance to people who are here undocumented also felons.
Okay, so you've got that side, which is essentially a wing of the Republican Party, but the Republican Party is really seriously divided on this issue in a way that the country is divided. The Republicans are, in a sense, reflect the divisions, even though they seem to be sharper within the party.
I think that's right, and I think part of that is that, you know, the tradition of the Republican Party has not been particularly restrictionist. In fact, up until maybe 6 or 7 years ago, it was more balanced between the two parties, and part of that was because of the AFL-CIO. The unions had a very restrictionist immigration policy. In recent years, the AFL-CIO has become one of the leading forces supporting a more generous immigration and liberal immigration policy. On the Republican side, you've always had basically the business community, which sees immigrant labor as something very beneficial to it, and that's been a dominant part.
And they're in favor of the guest worker program that the president's in favor of.
That's right, they
and
are.
The president is sort of on in the middle of all of this, on both terms of the security argument, but a more, if you will, enlightened view than the more extreme elements in his party.
I think that's accurate, and I think that the president would probably be willing to go along even with the legislation that's been proposed in the Senate, even though it doesn't seem to match his exact approach, but I think he'd be willing to go along with it.
What are the key provisions of the main Senate bills as they exist as of this moment? Because we know that they're going to change, because once they come back from recess, they either have to pass legislation or not.
That's right. That's right. First, let me talk about a provision which is not talked about as much, but I think it's very important because I think it could be the key to this whole issue of immigration reform, and that's the guest worker program. Under the bill that came out of the Specter Judiciary Committee, there would be up to 400,000 a year temporary workers that could come in lower skilled positions to the United States. And these would be, we're talking about people who are now outside of the United States and would be able to come in. In addition, during the markup of the Specter bill, there was an addition of what's called the Ag Jobs Act, and the Ag Jobs Act would provide special immigration legalization provisions for agricultural workers. So those two provisions are in the Specter proposal, and then there is a legalization program. And again, just like they did in 1986, you know, even the Specter plan, which is the simpler of the two, and I'll get to the second one in a second, it's like way too complicated. But basically what it would do is it would allow individuals who are not here in the United States to get temporary work status. The cutoff for that bill is January 7th, 2004. So already you're leaving out 2 years of people, which is really a big mistake, I think.
And then if you estimate that 500,000 come in a year, you've got another 1 million people lost already.
That's right, that's right. So it has a cutoff of, you had to have been here by January 7th, 2004. If you were here on that date and you have an employer willing to sponsor you, you can get temporary work authorization for up to 6 years in 3-year intervals. During that period, it's possible that an employer could sponsor you for permanent residence if the employer can show a continuing shortage of U.S. workers in a job that you're doing. And then at the end of those 6 years, you could file on your own for permanent residence. You would have to show that during that period you learned English, you have to pay certain fines. Of course, you have to have a criminal back taxes. There have to be criminal checks. So this then begins
to meet the objections of the people who are arguing that these people have not, the immigrants, the illegal immigrants, haven't paid their fair share, and in a sense are lawbreakers. So if you find them, have them pay their back taxes, you begin to ameliorate some of that.
That's right. And so And the bill also changes the way we allocate visas under what's called the preference system, family and employment-based applicants, to create more visas for those individuals as well. So the notion is that in 6 years, people who are here now in the United States, legally or illegally, who qualify for permanent residence, will get that permanent residence. Then along the way, we're not going to have a bigger problem with undocumented immigration, because we're going to allow these 400,000 lesser skilled workers to come to the United States.
So, I mean, are those the major outlines of the Senate bill? Now, if the Senate even passes a bill that includes these and other sections, how does the reconciliation with the House happen?
Well,
or is the bottom line in all this that nothing happens because they can't reconcile the differences?
Well, first let me say that the outline I gave you of the Senate bill has to do with the legalization provisions. There also are border control provisions.
Right.
There's no fence in the Senate Specter Senate bill, but there are resources and approaches to increasing border enforcement. I don't see a compromise. I think what has to happen is that the House would have to change its mind. Basically, I don't see that happening.
Not
frankly.
very likely.
I don't see it very likely happening either. I don't think because it's too much of a local issue to too many of the members of the House of Representatives. So what I'm thinking is we're not going to have immigration legislation. Getting too close to the November elections, I don't see us passing an immigration reform bill this year. And when we get to talk about the compromise that came out in the Senate, and you consider some of the restrictiveness that's in that compromise, which is basically tracks the Specter bill, and then you consider what probably would have to be given up in the House, I think that many in the pro-immigrants' rights movement are not so anxious to have a bill this year after all. The Specter bill and the Fritz compromise take us about as far, I think, of those of us who support undocumented immigrants getting legalization, as far as we can go. If they have to compromise with the House, it would go too far. We wouldn't be able to support the bill, and I think that's basically why the bill died in the Senate.
Okay. We'll
make
hold
sense?
this. Yeah,
That
it makes
makes
sense.
sense.
That makes sense.
A little complicated.
Okay, no, and we'll continue with this discussion in our next show, where we'll talk about the politics and also Wernick's way, how you would draft the ideal immigration bill. So we'll return.
I'm looking forward to it.
www.fair.org, the Federation for American Immigration Reform, generally more restrictionist, but very good data. www.nilc.org, the National Immigration Law Center, and then finally www.immigration